I mean, anybody that's worked in a professional sports environment in the performance and medical sector will testify that they get solicited all the time by people selling their wares and promising the earth, often kind of over-promising and under-delivering.
Launching the Sports Pundit Performance Podcast with you and try to create a bit more of a bridge, because performance generally seems to be completely siphoned off from the business side, right? The performance stuff often happens in silo. It's often, a medical conference or a performance conference, and it ends up being very technical and quite intimidating almost if you're coming from an exec background.
I just heard many times the phrase, we want to be more data-driven and data-led. And I actually thought to myself, is that really the case? Is that really what you want? Because...
Hello and welcome to the Sports Pundit Podcast, the show exclusively for the people shaping the future of sport. Driven by my curiosity working within the industry, I started this show to host conversations with decision makers from the MLB to the ICC, unpacking their strategies and industry shaping ideas.
On today's episode of the Sports Pundit Podcast, I'm joined by Rich Buchanan, a leading voice in performance strategy and one of the most thoughtful minds working at the intersection of elite sport, data, and leadership. Rich spent nearly 2 decades in the trenches of professional football, first as a physio, then as a performance director for Swansea City during their Premier League run. He's since held roles with the Premier League, DC United, and Zone 7, and now advises sports tech companies and delivers leadership masterclasses on how to embed high-performance cultures that actually work. Today's episode is a little different. It's not just a conversation, it's an announcement. Rich will be hosting a brand new spin-off of the Sports Pundit Performance Podcast. In this episode, we introduce the series, unpack Rich's journey through performance, and talk honestly about where the industry is heading next. So without further ado, please enjoy my conversation with Rich Buchanan. Welcome to the podcast. Let's kick things off with just hearing a little bit about you and your background.
Hi, Andy. Thanks for having me on. It's a pleasure to share a bit of my journey and thoughts in the performance space. I consider myself, and I've been referred to by others, as a 25-year veteran, which is a bit disappointing. I'm not sure where the time's gone, of the sports space. So I started all those years ago as a physiotherapist in the healthcare sector and the sports sector. And over the course of the next decade or so, I became a more skilled practitioner, which resulted in ending up in a leadership role, which is, I think, quite typical in the sports sector performance space. Because you're a competent technician, if you like, practitioner, you inherently end up just leading a team of competent practitioners. And that's exactly what I did. I ended up working at Swansea City in the Premier League with a large multidisciplinary team of experts behind the team, supporting the players and the coaching staff. It was my role as a performance director to manage and lead that team. Since leaving Swansea City, I transitioned a little bit across to one-to-one coaching in the performance space, and also exploring my curiosity around data analytics, AI, and ended up being a performance director, a leader of people, essentially, in an artificial intelligence company that serviced the sports sector. So that's my whistle-stop tour of the last 25 years.
Yeah, you've done well to keep it so short. Just to dive into it in a bit more detail, I guess, like the story of you joining that AI company, which was Zone 7, which is where we both got to know each other and work together for a period. There's quite a good story, I guess, of you trying to implement similar technological innovations a few years earlier at Swansea, maybe before the technology was ready. So I think that's maybe a good opportunity to kind of show where your head was at and the way that you were thinking about things even before that.
Yeah, I think being kind of like self and situationally aware of who we were at Swansea City and what we were trying to do. We were a smaller, lower budget team in the Premier League trying to compete against clubs with much greater resource on the budget side, but also on the personnel side. We took a collective approach to be responsibly innovative. We looked at our processes around how we collected data, how we managed data, and how we leveraged it, and tried to explore ways that we could optimize that for better outcomes. So I initiated a couple of projects that the team all kind of bought into. We tried to gain an edge, to be ahead of the curve and not just do what we'd always done, because we thought that was a way of perhaps gaining an advantage, but if not gaining an advantage, sustaining our outcomes as a team behind the team. We worked and collaborated with a well-known Formula One outfit to explore new data sets. We collaborated with some vision and cognition neuroscientists and ophthalmologists. We engaged with a consultancy company that looked at our data management and data flow and distribution and the insights we were gaining from that data. So we went quite hard, quite quickly in that space. And, fast forwarding a few years to when I ended up at Zone 7, I looked at a company that were trying to answer a question very similar to some of the questions we were trying to answer a decade ago.
In terms of making that transition from in-house working with a team to working for a vendor that's trying to provide for the sports industry, how did you find that transition?
Yeah, it's a great question because I probably went into that role with a bit of naivety, making some assumptions, I suppose, that the industry per se and people that held positions similar to the one I did at Swansea would be of the viewpoint that I was, i.e., let's be responsibly innovative and try and push the envelope on the way we do things. To my surprise, I suppose, that wasn't always the case. There was plenty of people, my peer group, that were eager to explore and kick the tires, shall we say, around AI and what Zone 7 were doing at the time. But there was plenty that just didn't want to engage, weren't ready to engage, and were quite happy functioning in their zone where, they didn't have to perhaps stretch and strain themselves and their team to move things forward at a rate that they were uncomfortable with.
Yeah. In terms of that innovating as well, I think I've had this discussion with a few other people in different parts of the sports industry, but I'm curious how it relates to performance. With your work at Swansea, how much of it were you looking to do in-house versus how much of it were you happy to kind of take an external vendor that had already kind of tried to answer that problem?
We took the viewpoint of trying to move quickly, but doing a kind of thorough, robust due diligence process on external vendors because we didn't have the resource and the knowledge and skills in-house to do all the things that we wanted to do. So it was a case of scanning the market and trying to very quickly but robustly assess, what did we need? Could we get it from the marketplace? Was it valid, accurate, trusted? And then how would that impact what we were doing already? How could we implement it without destabilizing the kind of tried and tested processes and procedures that were already in place? We didn't really try and build too much internally. We did have a data scientist and some analysts in situ, probably around 2014 time. So we had capability, just not at the volume required to go building lots of solutions ourselves in parallel. So they were very much part of the team that was doing due diligence, took on things that they felt they could do themselves, but we didn't overstretch ourselves.
Yeah. And how much do you think it was split, sort of inbound innovation that was coming to you and someone saying, hey, we've got this solution for a problem we think you might have, versus how much of it was outbound, you have a problem and then you go and scour the market for a solution to that problem?
I think sort of in the early 2010s, there was certainly inbound traffic. I mean, anybody that's worked in a professional sports environment in the performance and medical sector will testify that they get solicited all the time by people selling their wares and promising the earth, often kind of over-promising and under-delivering. Back in the early sort of 2010s, that was the case, but absolutely not the case, not the volume that people will be facing today. So yes, there was some inbound, but we were being curious enough to go outbound a lot of the time and very explicit with our problems that we were then seeking answers and solutions to. I think if you fast forward to today, it would probably be completely the other way around, where actually, you're just putting up the barriers because you're just getting inbound all the time. So I do think that that's perhaps a reason why sometimes the responsible innovation doesn't happen as quickly as we think it should, because people are just bombarded with companies soliciting them all the time.
Yeah. Have you come across any organizations, whether they're ones you've worked in yourself or just ones you've had colleagues at or had interactions with, where they've had a particularly good process for identifying and sort of scouting vendors and innovation? Because like you say, there's a lot of information out there. There's a lot of people trying to sell into sports teams. And as you also say, you're pretty time poor and quite light on resources in-house. So there's not that much time to dedicate to looking at potentially new solutions versus just taking care of what's maybe already required of you on a day-to-day basis.
Yeah. I won't name check or explicitly state any specific organizations because I don't think that would be fair. I would say it's rare that sports organizations, in my experience, have a really robust due diligence process. I think often decisions are made because, there's a request from above in the chain of command, or there's a kind of fear of missing out on something. There's an industry trend and it's just, jumping on the bandwagon. There certainly is organizations that I've engaged with as somebody on the external vendor side that have done really good due diligence processes. Ultimately starts with them knowing their use case. What's their problem? What do they have in situ already that potentially could answer their problem? If it's not, right, what do we need to go and see if the marketplace has something that provides a solution? So really understanding kind of your use case and then assessing the landscape to see what technology solution is out there that might help answer and deal with your use case. That would be the starting point. I think you brought up about build or buy at Swansea. I think that then kind of comes in the next phase. If you identify something that does answer your problem, I believe that then lots of organizations feel that they have a unique use case and a special set of circumstances and environment where to protect their IP, they have to go on this build journey. And often that requires, incredible resources, both financially, time, personnel, that sort of thing. So I don't know if that's the right route always. For some organizations, it will be. But then if it's not, you have to assess the marketplace and understand, okay, there'll be other organizations using the same technology, but can it answer, quickly, effectively, efficiently our use case? And does it do what we need it to do, essentially?
Mm-hmm.
And there's some further, I suppose, components of doing due diligence on technology, on things that essentially people might want to incorporate into the performance/medical space. And I possibly alluded to earlier, once you've decided you want to bring something in, you have to be very careful about then integrating it into what's already working, because you might bring something in and it destabilizes a very refined and effective process that's already existing. So, that integration piece is super important. And alongside that, I suppose the final piece of doing due diligence and implementation is then, getting the buy-in and the rollout plan amongst your people, making sure that there's a kind of culture of wanting to adopt, innovate, progress, and buy-in. Because if you bring something new into the environment and nobody uses it, then it collects dust on a shelf, or digital dust, where, it becomes a big, expensive mistake quite quickly. And I think sports performance is littered with things like that.
You mentioned at the start of that answer, decisions coming from higher up the chain, or like being mandated by higher up the chain. I think one theme that we discussed a lot when we were working together at Zone 7 was kind of the lack of people with maybe a performance background that end up in C-suite roles, right? Usually those positions are held by people that maybe come through the business side, the finance side, versus the physio or medical side, where because of the training that's gone into it, they're maybe less likely to end up in kind of like a more central kind of like sporting director type role, and how that then maybe impacts and informs decision-making and communication between those people in power and the people that maybe sit on the performance side, because there's very few that straddled both. I'm just curious to get your take on that in terms of like, because I think one of the key objectives, I guess, and we can come on to this in a little bit, of launching the Sports Pundit Performance Podcast with you and try to create a bit more of a bridge, because performance generally seems to be completely siphoned off from the business side, right? The performance stuff often happens in silo. It's often, a medical conference or a performance conference, and it ends up being very technical and quite intimidating almost if you're coming from an exec background. So it almost ends up just operating in its own world, which I think is why it's important to maybe try and bring it into the fold a little bit. So I'm curious to get your kind of philosophy on that, as someone that kind of probably uniquely sits in that position between the two. Also just your perspective on why you wanted to do this podcast together.
I think you're right in that typically sporting directors, C-suite execs come from the business side of sport. It's often not the performance side. There are some examples of people that have done that, and they're very competent professionals. My personal opinion on the C-suite sporting director roles that are not from the performance environment is that they understand that they line manage the performance environment, but because it's typically full of people in regulated professions, medical professions, sports science, psychology, all these kind of disciplines, they'll be optimal, they'll take care of themselves, they'll almost self-function. And in many cases, that's true, but I think what it leaves is a bit of disconnect and perhaps a lack of understanding how that disconnect isn't as optimal as it could be from a performance perspective. But if you were to ask people to define performance, you'd get lots of different answers, I suppose. But in my opinion, it fundamentally comes down to people. So as long as you've got all your people in whatever department, performance department, coaching department, the various business departments, all kind of pulling in the same direction and striving to achieve that sort of vision and mission of the organization, and understanding and having clarity on what their little piece of contribution does to achieving that, then you're likely to have a high performance environment, or certainly be well on your way to achieving your objectives, if you like. The performance personnel that have transitioned into those kind of sporting director and C-suite leadership roles are people that have upskilled themselves on the business side of sport and understand that things like player trading and, commercial deals actually fundamentally drive the organization. But to then optimize the organization, you have to optimize your assets, your players, your athletes, that kind of thing. And I dare say that they're some of the most effective operators in those C-suite / sporting director roles. I think if people come from purely one side without a broad knowledge of the other, then you're just missing a big piece of the puzzle. And like you said, typically the people in those roles come from that business side of sport.
How did you find that when you were in performance director roles yourself, in terms of how did you manage the communication process of trying to get across the kind of key information in a way that maybe makes sense to someone that isn't native to the performance side of sport?
It's a great question, and one that I probably honestly answered by saying I didn't do a very good job in the early days of being a performance director. Managing up and leading up, it is a skill in itself, much like managing people that you line manage. So now having a greater awareness of different leadership styles, different communication methods, ways of quickly kind of filtering areas that need to be focused on. Is it a knowledge and skills thing that needs to be communicated? Is it a motivation narrative that needs to be articulated? Is it something just about making sure that we have a network of information support, that kind of thing? So I think now in those roles, I'd be far more effective and targeted in the messages that I gave to the people in ways that they wanted information, rather than just laying it all out and hoping that they understood what I was talking about.
In terms of being in a performance director type role now, what else do you think has changed since maybe you held that type of role?
I think organizations have greater clarity on what that means. It can be different in different organizations, of course, but I think in typical fashion, it's just been a senior practitioner that then gets given kind of management responsibility, if you like, over a group of, say, more junior practitioners. Whereas now I think you're seeing organizations go, right, okay, what do we actually mean by a high performance director? My personal opinion is that yes, they have to have broad knowledge of a number of different areas on a technical level, but it's about people. It's about relationships. It's about communication and kind of understanding where the gaps are in your organization. Like I alluded to before, maybe there's a knowledge and skills gap. Maybe there's a motivation gap. Maybe there's a support gap. Maybe there's an ability gap with some of your personnel. So just being able to sort of target your attention or your organization's attention to a certain area. It's a generalist specialist role, in my opinion. And it's one that requires management skills and one that requires leadership skills. And the two are quite different.
I think it's an interesting point. You brought it up earlier as well, in terms of you sort of being promoted into a management role based on your competency as a practitioner. And I think that's true probably of a lot of jobs, right? Like you hear about this with engineering jobs as well, right? Like the most competent engineer becomes a manager and actually their productivity goes down because they're not necessarily good with people. They're just really competent at engineering, right? So I think it's important maybe to distinguish that competency, I guess, on one area doesn't necessarily translate through to the other.
Absolutely. And I think in this ever increasing digital world that we live in, perhaps people skills are decreasing. Educational courses, masterclasses, online and in person, around being a more effective leader and manager of people in lots of different industries, not just the sports performance space. And it's a skill that can be applied and learned and honed in, at lots of levels of an organization, in lots of different industries, and even in your personal life. And I think there's a danger possibly with this kind of digital revolution that we're all experiencing, that we kind of de-skill and almost become consciously incompetent a little bit about dealing and communicating with each other.
Yeah, I mean, with AI tools, it's probably easier than ever to not outsource and just do everything yourself, right? If you're a team of one. So it's just even less opportunity to directly interact with people and to learn from others. And then another part of this is like, I've worked from home since COVID. So I only spent 2 years ever in an office around other people. And there's definitely an element of not having that opportunity to learn from seeing others do the work, right? And so I think there is a need, I guess, to kind of actively try to address that shortfall, I guess.
Agreed. And, in sport, you'll have directors of high performance, head of performance. And, one of the questions I ask them are you genuinely a high performance team, or would you consider yourself somewhere in between on a continuum? And then ask them why. And I'm not backing this up with any significant research findings here. This is opinion and incidental evidence. Those organizations and perhaps teams behind the teams that function well and perhaps to the outsider looking in would be considered high performance. The one kind of commonality, if you like, is that everybody knows what's expected of them. There's a set of kind of unwritten rules that just allows things to function and work in an optimal way. They all have strong relationships with each other. It's an awareness of what we're striving to, what the outcome is, and being able to communicate with each other really effectively, appreciating each other's skill set, but challenging, experts in their lane, which then educates other people. And, they're the sort of common traits that I see in high performance environments. Functioning performance support environments that perhaps you would consider low performance or lower performance, usually it's not a knowledge and skills thing. It's not an ability thing. It's usually a kind of breakdown of the environment on a personal level, maybe competing agendas, maybe lack of an ability to work together effectively. You don't have to be friends, but you have to be effective and complement each other. The commonality is the lack of kind of togetherness and cohesion amongst the people.
Yeah. And just going back to the launch of the Sports Pundit Performance Podcast and the fact that you're going to be doing these 5 episodes, what are the key objectives for you in terms of what you would like to get across from having those conversations and types of people that you're hoping to have the conversations with?
Yeah, I think, just to continue on the technology and the data side to start with, that's definitely something that, is at the fore right now. So kind of understanding and building on a little bit of what I've alluded to today is, how organizations view that kind of data-driven versus data-informed approach, how vendors perhaps can showcase their products, their offerings, their processes to build trust and answer some of the questions that people will have when doing due diligence. How technology is, being democratized, typically technology that services an elite environment, can that be rolled out and offered to the amateur athlete or, the casually curious, if you like, the sports enthusiast? So that's one area. Another area, I think, again, hot topic is women's sport. Is the approach there a lift and shift from some of the established ways of doing things, or is it an opportunity to completely generate your own sporting identity and do things a little bit different? So, I'm looking forward to potentially diving into some of those areas. Another topic area is around performance coaching one-to-one and how that's benefited in sort of cross-sector areas, things like the world of entertainment, the corporate space, the C-suite execs, and see if there's any kind of commonalities there that can be drawn out and applied. I'm also curious to explore athlete talent ID and development and how that links into the business of sport. So, how much of an important factor are things like academies to essentially bring players through and operate as maybe businesses within a business, if that makes sense? Or are they considered just simply community engagement programs? And I'm keen to speak to some of the performance people in that space and get their understanding of how they see their role in the wider kind of like business operations of their organization.
Yeah, I think from a commercial perspective, the kind of youth participation, or even just kind of participation more broadly, you've got talent ID, which I think is maybe more obvious why clubs would be interested in that, right? You've got a pipeline towards the first team. Then you've also got a ton of people that are never going to make it, but participation is arguably the best way to generate fandom, right? Like the sports that you're most engaged with are likely ones that you're actively participating in, right?
I think you've hit the nail on the head. It's multifaceted. And I think for what it's worth, the organizations that understand they can impact all those areas in parallel are the ones that, will be successfully leveraging that kind of like area as a business. Yes, there's talent ID and player development to get the pathway right and build one of your own essentially. But, that on its own probably isn't enough. And I'm absolutely sure that some organizations are using their academies as businesses to generate income, knowing full well that many of the talented youngsters that they do develop are never actually going to make it to their top tier in whatever sport it is that we're talking about. Again, slightly out of my comfort zone and my lane is that area that you talk about around creating fandom. Yes, it could be a community engagement project, but I think with technology, that fandom can be global, right? Can you make a youngster on the other side of the world feel affiliated to your organization by having some kind of digital academy type offering where they are being served in a way through a digital medium that makes them feel part and parcel of your sports organization? And obviously you can then positively impact their own personal development and growth in that chosen sport.
You mentioned there a little bit about sports technology. So I think maybe just to finish, be interesting to get your perspective on the next sort of 12 to 24 months from your perspective, what they look like. I know you're working with a sports technology company now in player data. So I'm curious to get your perspective on what opportunities you think are ahead for them, but also for yourself, maybe more broadly.
Yeah, I think there's a couple of things at play. I think you've got those organizations that are already quite well ahead of the curve in what they're doing. And it's about building their trust and their ability, I suppose, to leverage the data they've already got using AI, the ability to impact their decision making and increase their trust in AI's analysis of the data that they've already got. So that's probably at one end of the spectrum. Then halfway sort of back down, if you like, you've got these organizations that are collecting data and probably leveraging it in a very rudimentary manual way, but still need to do a whole host of housekeeping. So, Apollo, one of the companies I also do a bit of consultancy for, that's very much designed to help organizations kind of get their data and their digital offerings ordered and organized so that they can progress and start to leverage it in more sophisticated ways. And then as we slide back down the continuum, you mentioned player data. There's also this kind of technological advancement where what used to be the sort of exclusive use cases of elite organizations is now being democratized to a broader audience, be that from GPS devices or chips in lots of other areas that can generate a data set for that kind of amateur athlete, that casually curious sports person, so that they feel like they can compare and contrast themselves to those at the other end of the spectrum in the elite professional sector.
Just to finish off, you mentioned data there. And I think one thing that I really took from you during our time at Zone 7 together was there was often this phrase data driven used by a lot of organizations. And you'd always correct that to data informed. So I think that would just be a nice thing to finish on as kind of your philosophy around that.
Yeah, I think it comes back to people understanding what their problem is and what their use case is when it comes to data. I just heard many times the phrase, we want to be more data driven and data led. And I actually thought to myself, is that really the case? Is that really what you want? Because that, to a certain extent, means making decisions on data that you absolutely have to be sure is valid and accurate, almost devolving yourself of decision-making responsibility and kind of making yourself, I think I mentioned it earlier, kind of consciously incompetent, if you like, because you're kind of de-skilling yourself in your clinical reasoning or, your executive mindset and again, decision making. So if you really truly want to be data led, I'm not saying that that's wrong, but you have to be aware of what that means. And actually what I feel that most people that were saying these things meant is that they wanted to be data informed. They wanted an extra perspective, if you like. So again, Zone 7, the company where we met, was offering an extra perspective to that multidisciplinary performance team in the football space and other sporting spaces around injury risk forecasting. As a physio, I might have an opinion. As a doctor that I work with, they might have an opinion. Maybe some of the other members of staff, the sports scientists, the S&C coaches, the psychologists would have an opinion on a particular player at a particular moment. But the data would also indicate an opinion. And then it was our job to assess whether that opinion aligned with ours. And if it didn't, could we question our own opinion to see whether we still thought we were right, or maybe we should think that the indicators from the data were right. And it's that kind of like human skill set, that reasoning, that intelligence, emotional intelligence, if you like, to kind of understand that it's an opinion and that it might inform our opinion. So that's what I mean by data informed. And I think that's what generally people are currently comfortable with and actually are looking for. In the future, fast forward 5 years, 10 years, 20 years, and things like AI are far more sophisticated than they are now. Will it be data informed that we're looking for, or will it be kind of, data led, data driven? I don't know, but I suspect, as we've all done with tools like ChatGPT, we're handing over lots of responsibility to algorithms to kind of inform our thinking. So, maybe that will accelerate over the next few years, and we will become perhaps a little bit more digitally led.
But I think it's an important thing to consider, right? Because just because you have data doesn't necessarily mean that is right or reflects what might happen in the future, because the data is always going to be in the past, right?
Of course. Yeah, of course. And, lots of people in the sports performance sector, and I'm generalizing, so please, I hope nobody takes offense, will take the data with blind faith as being valid and accurate. And actually, what they haven't done is they haven't contextualized it. They haven't sense checked whether, the data is valid and accurate. And, ultimately, that's your job as a sports performance practitioner or a practitioner in a certain discipline within that performance team, if you like, to do that.
Yeah. I was just listening to a podcast this morning with Rory Sutherland, who's a famous marketing guy, really into behavioral economics. And he was talking about something really similar, because he was saying that Taco Bell, I think 15 years ago, launched in London and it completely flopped. And if you were to just look at the data, you'd say that the UK wasn't ready at that point for Tex-Mex food. But it turned out that it was because the door was down an alleyway. And so the entrance was kind of obscured. But if you purely looked at the data, you'd say they opened in a really good location in central London and no one went. So therefore people didn't want Taco Bell, or they didn't want that type of cuisine. And until you contextualize it by saying, well, it's because the door was down an alleyway, then you don't actually get the full picture. And I think sometimes people can be blinded to that, right? They think they've got the statistics on the piece of paper in front of them, and then that's the conclusion that they're drawing. So I think that's not obviously in the performance space, and you're not advocating anyone to go get Taco Bell, but actually an interesting anecdote that kind of fits the same principles.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I sat yesterday in a conference listening to somebody articulate their kind of scouting, recruitment, talent ID platform, and talked about how they can incorporate all the various metrics around the technical aspects of the game, the tactical aspects, and filter players that way. And the question that popped into my head was, well, perhaps a player that's been filtered out isn't showing up because their particular coach doesn't ask them to do certain things in that team. It doesn't mean they can't. So are you missing out on a viewpoint on a player because of context rather than just filtering by data and really narrowing your lens? And I think clubs that heavily use data and use it successfully will know these things and will obviously apply their own self-correcting mechanisms. But the danger is sort of en masse that people don't apply context, exactly like you mentioned with Taco Bell, and draw conclusions that are actually, not appropriate.
Yeah, well, that's a great place to end. And I appreciate you coming on the podcast, and I'm excited to see where the conversations go that you have over the next few weeks.
Yeah, very much looking forward to them. And, the guests that we'll be interviewing are high quality and will add a real richness in perspective and value to the sports pundit community, I've no doubt.
Yeah, for sure. And I think, like with Leanne, I think one common characteristic that you both share is that curiosity. I think that kind of transcends across everything that the community is about. It's just trying to get different perspectives and take those different ideas forwards in a way that's relevant within your own context.
Fantastic, Andy. Thanks for having me on.
Thanks for listening to the Sports Pundit Podcast. I'll include more info about the guest and the topics covered in the show notes. And you can also find my LinkedIn profile if you'd like to connect and let me know what you thought. Visit sportspundit.co to find previous editions of the podcast, access the newsletter, and to sign up for our WhatsApp group and see upcoming social events in cities around the world. See you again soon.